In 1 Corinthians 12, the Apostle Paul includes the word of wisdom in his list of 9 spiritual gifts. What is the word of wisdom, and how does it operate in the church? Dr. David K. Bernard explains, so don't go away. Welcome to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, a podcast dedicated to helping modern-day believers live out the teachings of the first century church. This podcast is part of the teaching ministry of Dr. David K. Bernard. Dr. Bernard has dedicated his life to studying the Bible and helping believers apply its message to their daily lives. In Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, Dr. Bernard answers your questions about what the Bible teaches and how those teachings apply to everyday life. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, the Apostle Paul, of course, provides us with a list of 9 spiritual gifts. We've covered 2 of these gifts, prophecy and tongues, in a previous episode, so people can go check that out. But today I want to ask you about another one of those spiritual gifts that Paul mentions, and that is the word of wisdom, which he mentions in verse 8 of 1 Corinthians 12. Well, now, when we modern people hear the phrase word of wisdom, we might think of a wise statement like, actions speak louder than words, or birds of a feather flock together. But is offering wise advice what the Apostle Paul had in mind in this passage, or is he referring to something else?
He's referring to a supernatural spiritual gift. So if you study 1 Corinthians 12 carefully, Paul is saying we're all members of the same body, but we don't all have the same function. We don't all have the same gifts. So then he lists 9 spiritual gifts, and I don't think these are necessarily exhaustive, but they're illustrative. And he says, some people exercise this, some people exercise that, some people exercise that. Not everyone will exercise all of them. And so from the total discussion, these are gifts of the Spirit. So from the total discussion, you see that they're supernatural, they're spiritual. When I say supernatural, they don't just come from our natural human abilities and experiences. They come as a gift directly from God. For example, he mentions miracles, tongues. So we're to understand these to be not continuous in a person's life and not in everybody's life, but special endowments. If you look at it carefully, it says word of wisdom. So it's not all divine wisdom, but a portion, a specific portion of divine wisdom for a specific purpose at a specific time to a specific individual. Now, I believe anyone who is filled with the Spirit could potentially exercise any spiritual gift, but it's as God decides. So it's for the occasion. It's not continuously their whole life, and they're not going to have all 9 gifts necessarily. But as the occasion rises, God might give you or me a word of wisdom for a particular moment. Now, I think it's helpful to think of the spiritual gifts as considering 3 dimensions. So for each of these gifts, it appears there is a natural human counterpart. So there is human wisdom. So even an atheist can study, can have life experiences, and can develop life wisdom. And so some of the statements you've quoted represent common human wisdom. So there's that basis of natural human wisdom. Then there's spiritual wisdom. The book of Proverbs and many other places teaches spiritual wisdom. Every child of God should develop wisdom in their spiritual life. So Paul couldn't have been talking about those first 2 because he's specifically saying not everybody's going to have this, but potentially everyone can have natural human wisdom. And we hope and we aspire that everyone will have spiritual wisdom for daily life. So this has to be a 3rd dimension, which that term word indicates. It's a specific portion of divine wisdom. So now, he also mentions word of knowledge. So you can contrast this. Knowledge is information. So you can acquire knowledge through study, through learning, through reading, etc. Wisdom is the application of knowledge. So it is guidance or insight, how to use knowledge. So someone can be very smart, but not have wisdom. Somebody can be very knowledgeable, very highly educated, but not have wisdom. And we sometimes say they don't have common sense. So wisdom is how to use your knowledge properly. So if you're going to make a distinction, then a word of knowledge would be God imparts specific information at a specific time that you would not know by human means to help you in something. But wisdom would be God imparting guidance or insight or knowing what to do, knowing what to say in a specific time. So you can see that could be very valuable, particularly for those in leadership that at particular times they don't know what to do, but God can give them immediate insight. So it's more than human reasoning or experience. It's even more than learning to live for God day by day and making wise choices. But you're faced with an urgent situation, a crisis, a decision, and you have no human means of knowing what to do. But then God speaks to you in some form. God reveals to you, and suddenly you know, I need to do this. Absolutely. That's a word of wisdom.
Is there an example in Scripture that would illustrate what a word of wisdom is in operation?
I think a very good example is in Acts 27, when Paul was a prisoner and he was going to Rome under arrest in a ship. And he told the captain of the ship, don't travel. It's wrong. It would be a bad mistake to travel. We're going to have shipwreck. Well, the weather was fine. There was no objective reason for Paul's statement. He wasn't an expert. The captain was an expert. So the captain ignored him. But as it turned out, they did shipwreck, and they would have lost their life, except God spoke to Paul and said, if you tell them to all stay with the ship, they'll be saved. So Paul said, look, don't abandon the ship or you'll die, but if you stay with the ship, you'll be saved. And they were. So to me, that was the word of wisdom. Paul had no natural means of knowing what was the right thing to do, but God showed him what to do. Now, as it turned out, they didn't follow his advice the first time, but I think he had a track record. So then when it came that they were in danger of all drowning, they did listen to him. So the word of wisdom did operate in Paul to save the whole ship. So to me, that's an example of divine guidance or insight for a specific situation where you really have no natural means of making that decision.
Can you share with us an example maybe where you've received a word of wisdom or somebody's given you a word of wisdom in your ministry?
Well, I'll give what I think is a classic example in my father's ministry. So my parents were the pioneer missionaries of the United Pentecostal Church to the country of Korea. So this would have happened, I think, in the late 70s. So there was some turmoil, and there's a minister who had been disciplined for misconduct. So he left the church, and he gathered a small group, and it seems like they were trying to attack the church. So they reported to the government that my father was trying to overthrow the government and assassinate the president, which of course was bogus. But it appears their goal was to get the church dissolved and then the assets maybe distributed to them. So anyway, so my dad was under investigation. The church was under investigation, pretty severe. Well, my dad was supposed to go to the first World Conference of the UPCI in Jerusalem. He was going to be one of the speakers, but he felt like God told him, don't go. So that's a very prestigious invitation. Why would you turn that down? But he said, he felt like God said, don't go. So he didn't go. Well, later, he was called into the government office and they said, we did a thorough investigation and we learned that you were going to Jerusalem. So we were going to just, because Korea is a close ally of the U.S., so they didn't want an international incident. But they said, we had decided that when you flew to Jerusalem and then when you try to come back, we would just deny reentry. And that way we would end this problem with no diplomatic incident. But you didn't go. So we had to do a thorough investigation, and we found that your accusers are liars. We exonerate you, and you're free to continue your ministry. Wow. So had my dad gone, that would have ended our missionary experience there. It would have been devastating to the church. But because for no good reason, so to speak, humanly speaking, he felt like God told him not to go, then that saved the ministry and the church. So to me, that's an example of the word of wisdom.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. We also appreciate it when you share apostolic life in the 21st century with a friend or family member. And make plans to join us again next time as we look at how the Bible applies to everyday life.